Welcome to Windows on the World, and tonight we're going to explore what it means that the global mafia have won the UK election, and we're going to get into the wider issues and the bigger picture and also some philosophical reasoning. Well, first let's talk about the UK paper of choice for the vacuous and virtue signalling. Yes, the UK Guardian. It announced, where will they all sit? Commons welcomes 334 rookie MPs in most diverse parliament. Well, that's kind of meaningless, isn't it? But what they mean is they have a lot of new change agents. And these MPs are, as it describes, very inexperienced. In fact, a spokesman for the House of Commons said, it will be rather like Freshers' Week. It is going to be huge. Most of them won't know their way round at all or even know what to do. Well, that's a very true statement, but that does not matter. They are an army of trained change agents. The moment has arrived when the drones enforce the inevitable. Well, inevitable only because of public ignorance. Well, let's put it this way. It is actually a good job they have been instructed on their new roles. Many already will be known, of course, as future leaders, as described by the steering groups, think tanks, and many are already members of the steadfast and ongoingly subversive Fabian Society. It is a massive logistical change for Parliament and a challenge, said the spokesman for the House of Commons. It carries on. This article in The Guardian, Labour's landslide victory will mean the most dramatic transformation in the makeup of the 650-seat lower house in decades, with Keir Starmer's parliamentary party having almost doubled in size and added 211 more members to its benches. The UK voting system, actually, is a good example of the power of groupthink in regard to the inability to partake in problem solving. That's going to be the thesis and the main thrust of today's show, but it is very positive. So I think what this is all about is the real solutions. And that's what we like to give on our shows on Windows on the World. Otherwise, to be frank, to be fair, there's absolutely no point. So it recently went back to Labour. UK recently went back to Labour last couple of days, a party which stands only in this time for global totalitarian community and the goals of Agenda 2030. That's a UN implementation of global to local control through the limiting of resources which are owned and distributed by favoured corporations. Well, of course, the Labour Party now stands for nothing else. The modern day result of the Fabian Society and its long-term infiltration and control plan has come into fruition with this new system of puppetry. What were called intellectuals grasped onto these principles and became known as communists or humanists. The so-called Age of Enlightenment also led into where we are now. The Blairites and New Labour in the 80s were the ignition of communitarianism, the big society which came in actually under a conservative government. But here is the dichotomy. Those who believe that the policies of the two or three main parties are going to be in any way different from each other are still not even on the first rung of the learning ladder. And unfortunately, many that I have had to leave behind in the past because of this are still not on the first rung. But even at this late stage, there are many who still align with the old world concept of the workers uniting. They unite, of course, through steering groups. One is even called Unite. These are still known, of course, as trade unions. This is a false premise, but used to manipulate those who need to feel like they are part of the created fantasy of the worthy struggle. Well, the only struggle now is in the race for facing reality and seeing through simple but subversive sound bites which cover the real goals. Cartoon realities, of course, are created by groups and publications such as the Socialist Worker, the Morning Star, etc. These Newspapers provide embarrassing cartoon cliches and are sold at the side of roads by irritating and usually uptight neurotics. I can say this with some confidence, as I've often stopped to actually test this out. And what comes back is pretty uniform. Ad hominems, of course, logical fallacies, and then anger and neurosis. Well, to see how debate has been eroded into sound bites and ad hominems, try talking to one of these bio-robots about global goals and infiltration through community steering. They will come out with conspiracy theorist and unhinged ad hominem attacks on you if it goes on more than a few minutes. Try it just to see if it works. I guarantee it does. Let me know how you get on. info@windowsontheworld.net. So what then do they actually mean by labour? The exploited manual workers of the industrial era were given their party, and according to popular legend, the origins of what became the Labour Party emerged in the late 19th century. It represented the interests, it says, of the labour unions and more generally the growing urban working class. It was to control and manipulate the masses and keep them in the worthy idea of class struggle. However, the Labour Party is now simply the Global Mafia Party. So, the Global Mafia just won the UK election. NATO and the manipulators of war for legalised plunder are the controllers of the globalist puppet and the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. This is as empty as leadership can get. This is not even artificial intelligence. It's an insult to technology to call it that. Such is the base level of programming that went into this characterless, empty container filled only with short sound bites and keywords. These bio-robotic non-entities, though, are the most dangerous. The Conservative Party were the enablers. The Labour Party are the mafia enforcement team. We are indeed in Act 3. All sound bites are in place, and they, of course, start with the C word, change, code for communitarian communism. The drone leader of the global mafia-controlled Labour Party has already delivered the endgame, hidden in buzzwords. His opening speeches have been beyond sinister to anyone who knows the language of the real and the stated goals. The word community, respect and service were used. Being rather engaged with our Discord group this morning, I actually wrote something and I'm going to read it out because I think it sums things up pretty succinctly and fits into the show very nicely. Community meaning a policed and self-policing entity. Service as in servile. Respect as in not saying anything except inclusive, acceptable sound bites. And of course, being in constant fear of doing so. Starmer is just their global community UK-based catchphrase cover story merchant. Nothing more. He is selling sound bites for the purposes of repetition by the administrators to cover the simple plan behind it all. In short, he is selling sound bites which cover the real aims, which are in plain sight to anyone who has looked at the global goals and has any sentient awareness. Unfortunately, most still do not, and this has been very well socially engineered through solipsism, narcissism, and really the dependence on sound bites and the lack of insight into the reality which actually surrounds people. If we take away our opinions of this empty shell of a spineless nobody, Keir Starmer, and use simple memes to define it with simplicity, I actually believe it has more effect. This is, I think, the key. It strips away the need for any emotional reaction, which of course is what feeds the memetic war. Emotional reactions are exactly what this distraction thrives on. Although created artificial drones like Starmer are just a product of indoctrination, steering groups along with think tanks, they are still reprehensible to any sentient being with conscious awareness, or should be. So the Fabians and elite got their puppet into power, so in reality the names of these parties are irrelevant. They were both drivers of change for the abolition of personal freedom and property. It is mainly, of course, the middle classes who are recruited to destroy their own position and, of course, their future for the self-anointed and appointed elite. Unfortunately, many feel that this political masquerade of voting globalist Labour is a good cover story for their own lack of integrity and also for their perceived social credibility. It attracts the fake, the lost and the ignorant. Their needs to be accepted into the norms of the system were manufactured entirely for this purpose. We are at that stage now. We have a whole army and armies of manufactured drones with no real insight or proper and constructed, thought about opinions of their own. Vote Labour, well, it sounds worthy, doesn't it? Cartoon groups are a great cover for the elite system which the victims of it profess to oppose. They recruit those who need a public facade to cover their privilege, or they have just been made to feel guilty by their self-conscious peer group. I've seen a lot of that in those I have chosen to leave behind. You must have too, of course. The perceived system that they follow has never worked, but they are in group egregores which work in the minds of those participating in them. It is a social activity disguised as class struggle, completely and utterly fake and empty. The way they describe and present this fantasy has nothing whatsoever to do with the system of governance in the present time. So the misdirection of the 2 or 3 party system wins again, and the population lost once again. They could have voted strategically, but they never learned strategy. This groupthink capturing system protects the individual from thinking and, of course, personal responsibility. This is because they have fallen for a cover story. Well, it's almost as absurd as the Trump distraction in the USA. It's a media-friendly soap opera, something to watch when the soaps have finished. An egregore to capture the imagination and keep that hamster wheel spinning. So, this is what we're talking about, the system. We're not talking about the facade and the name of this party, which used to be called Labour, but is now the new Global Mafia party. We're talking about the system which underpins it. And that system could be changed overnight, but obstacles are put in the way in every front. Their agents are literally everywhere. This, of course, was called the big society. The same obstacles are always used. The same false arguments never change, except in their intensity and, of course, their degree of success. Well, the closing down of knowledge is actually to be expected, isn't it? It has always been done. The pyramid of power simply describes it all. Let's describe it. At the top are the self-defined elite. In the middle, those that serve that elite as administrators or priests of the system, their system. They instruct and influence others. At the bottom of the pyramid, the preserved actually, or even the perceived serfs and followers of all orders. That was also known as the proletariat, of course. This all relies on consent, and consent is gained through pressure, well, socially engineered pressure. We've done shows on revolution and what that is. Revolution is them, it's never the people. And we've looked at the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution and the thought leaders behind that. This is merely the next stage. Of course, their first plan was to abolish monarchy. We are now at a much more advanced stage, and we have gone into the technocratic era. In this system, the choices, though, are simply removed, as any successful salesperson, of course, will know. Limited choices are given, and nothing outside is immediately available. The only necessary goal is steering into the intended outcome, those who are participating. In present-day politics, this is, of course, easier than it has ever been. However, the choices are still there, but it takes a revelation, not a revolution. Never a revolution, as that is their method and only talked about by those who would actually not even dare to partake in one. Isn't that just the truth? Those fraudulent fake lefties of the past were always going on about revolution. When the revolution comes, well, no, when the revolution comes, they will be hiding, playing on their computers, or afraid to lose their universal credit, or whatever else they have participated in. So those people who talk about the revolution are the biggest cowards on planet Earth. So revelation here in meaning is to step back and observe. So why is this impossible? Well, of course it's not. It is just forgotten amid the pressure to choose one side against the other. Why do those in arrested development choose to blame one of the two given political parties? I mean, this is quite unbelievable. I had to get rid of people I knew in the music business and were actually very good friends of mine, and I respected what they did until they appear on social media with a mug with F the Tories, and they blame everything on the Tories. It's like this naivety they've never grown out of. It's like Joe Strummer in 1977 with his fake revolutionary spirit, even though I do quite like The Clash because it's rock and roll, and I preferred what came after Big Audio Dynamite, to be honest, but let's not get into trivia. This is really because their belief system appears to be supported by one or the other parties. But who gave them this belief? Well, they would say nobody did. They would say they think for themselves, but this is not the case. The surface arguments have nothing to do with the plan which continues behind both these parties, or in reality, the three parties, as Reform now have seats also. The closing down of choice and knowledge is to be expected in the present time. It is, however, on an industrial scale, as it is, of course, an industry. It happens easily, of course, because there is no vigilance. Vigilance is essential. Without vigilance, we are consciously and unconsciously infiltrated 24 hours a day. Now, I don't mean like hypervigilance. That can be useful when you are actually under attack, however. But what I'm really talking about is relaxed awareness. And that means being aware of what's actually going on around you and being able to observe it with some small iota of critical thinking. Even this would be a major help. The public are steered into different distraction groups, the system of moods and groupthink. These groups control not just the surface response, but the unconscious, and importantly, most importantly, they control the emotions of the participants. The emotion reaction is the best for control. For example, I remember seeing someone I knew very well crying when Jeremy Corbyn was elected. Now, that could be perceived in two ways, but I think it was with this joy of emotion that everything was going to change. The public projected an image onto Jeremy Corbyn. It turned out to be yet another deception, a deception which was voluntary. The man was an insipid boot kisser, and rather than go down in history or die on his sword, he decided to capitulate. And he could have at one point completely exposed the tactics of the global mafia. But he chose to bow down to those who had engineered his downfall. What a spineless coward. On the other hand, the emotional aspect also brings the necessary intolerance and the need for, yes, the C word, used properly, change. It brings change to the situation. The intolerance is useful on all levels, as people will repeat whatever they are told in response to a fallacious argument. Well, the sort of politics today that we have can be encapsulated by an incident I reported on several years ago. I'm going to give you an example now because we're going to be seeing a lot more of this sort of thing. I remember this incident, and it really does encapsulate the cartoon reality of the fake New Labour class struggle, gone actually full on stupid. You can find it at windowsontheworld.net, and it's called Fascists UK Hope Not Hate. Well, as they use the word fascists in a completely meaningless way, they deserve it used back on them. However, if you put Hope Not Hate into windowsontheworld.net, you will see some fascinating insights, and we are going to have a lot more of this under the new global mafia labour system. Well, what happened was, some banner-waving Marxists of the RMT Union heard something or saw something in a tweet from global mafia front puppets, Hope Not Hate, that some dangerous conspiracy theorists were meeting in London. Well, these willing, ideologically steered dupes or masked mercenaries and banner-waving soundbite no-passaran shouting Marxists arrived at the meeting in central London to confront what they had been told were fascists. Of course, then we had the renter mob, the tool of the so-called deep state, let's leave it there, Antifa, just a government steering group. And they were shouting fascist scum off our streets at what was in effect a public meeting for elderly intellectuals. And in reality, they had no idea what they were doing there. And the RMT Union were waving flags and standing there shouting no passaran and fascist scum off our streets and these meaningless nonsense at the behest of these degenerates, Hope Not Hate. And when they arrived, they found a group of mostly elderly academics having their monthly meet-up going into this venue. Well, cognitive dissonance was on display, but one of the masked black-clad mob actually assaulted an elderly man, and it could have got a lot worse, because this is groupthink. These people are in a thought group, and that thought group has a mind of its own, even though its members are mindless, because they are there through an ideology which is completely incorrect, but that doesn't matter. Cognitive dissonance was clearly on display, but then this was the interesting point. A very fascinating psychological conflict arose, and this defined the whole situation and exposed the shallow stupidity of these more than willing dupes who had congregated. A black member of this targeted group, which was called 9/11 Keep Talking, had a big bag of books and he was looking through them outside the venue. And one of the Antifa clones shouted at him, "Hey you, did you steal those?" A fatal memetic mistake had been made. The owner of the bag of books replied, "Are you saying that because I'm black?" The moral high ground assumed by the cartoon character Agitator had been ripped apart. He was now a right-wing racist, and all because of a careless accusation. In this memetic scene of warfare, memes are so important, and this is one of the things that I've been talking about for so long. If we learn the principles of their system and use it back on them to make them look like the agitators and the so-called fascists, then that is called a victory. So this idiot had to back down and say, well, no, of course not. But he had already lost the meme war and he had to back off. And at that moment, there was a shift and the whole thing changed slightly. Some of them were actually starting to engage with the people going in and said, well, we're just going to this meeting. And they said, but we heard that you were a bunch of fascists. And they said, well, actually, no, in your definition of that term, we're probably the opposite. Because we have been accused of being in a group where the far left and the far right meet up to discuss things. This is what Hope Not Hate said, because they couldn't say this group were far right, because a lot of them were old lefties. So they said it's where the far left and the far right meet to discuss and manufacture hate. Well, both the unions and the Antifa cartoon mob had been brought to the event by Hope Not Hate, a front group, yes, just for the World Revolutionary Movement. It was posted on Twitter, and without question or inquiry, the union leaders of the RMT and the renter mob fakes of Antifa had made their way down there over a tweet. And the whole story of how this conflict arose was concocted through gross exaggeration or lies of what someone may have said at some time in the past. And that is what we are getting coming through the words of Keir Starmer. That's exactly what he's saying. All this civic responsibility, the talk of community, the talk of change, this is what and where it is heading into. And that is actually how governance of the people now works. This is the unreal post-truth. post-truth world, post-fact ideological world of community steering. It is successful as it blocks memory and intellect in favour of theatre and surface noise. And without the functions of memory and intellect, the person becomes a compliant and easy to manage bio-robot. This is also known, of course, as a knee-jerk response. So I'm just going to have a very quick break here, because that was a lot of info, and I hope it's having some impact, and I hope you're finding it interesting. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. So we've been discussing global governance. Yes, what we've been talking about for many years is accelerating. We've been talking about how governance of the people really works. The unreal post-truth world, the post-fact ideological world, and community steering. Yes, we've been talking about how this has been successful and blocks memory and intellect in favour of theatre and surface noise. And I gave an example of that just before the break. We're going to see a lot more of this, by the way. This is where it's all going. It's going to get more banal from now on. And it was pretty banal before, wasn't it? Well, without the functions of memory and intellect, the person becomes a compliant and, of course, easy to manage bio-robot. Hence, we get non-personalities such as Keir Starmer. Here's a good example of a non-personality, an empty shell, a bio-robot. And behaviour of this sort is not consistent, of course, and it creates gaps in knowledge. This is when we are not using the functions of memory and intellect. And basically, the victim of the choose your side argument, that's what we're talking about here. And they do not have the necessary integrity, which is based on knowledge and fact. This means the individual manipulated in this way is, of course, very unbalanced. They are even easier, of course, to control when they are in this state. That is the whole purpose of it. This conflict manifests in contradictory behaviour and inconsistency in life tasks and communication. Interesting, you can see this when so-called right-wing video journalists go out and ask young Asian or foreign students what they have, which is under what they call white privilege. In other words, how are they controlled by white privilege and how do they define it? They cannot actually define what it is. And that, of course, is just a simple example. So it drives neurosis, which is actually really just a mental illness. And so the Mafia win again. This is what happens when the psyche and the soul are not integrated into the person and the belief system has no foundation. This causes inner conflict, and you can see that. There was these young girls who were being interviewed, and they were saying, well, you know, how does white privilege affect you? And what do you actually think it is? They were in conflict. They couldn't answer. They knew what to say. They knew that to say that there was white privilege and white male privilege especially, but they didn't have a response to actually what it was. So this is why you can see when they back off and they go, well, I've got to go. This is just causing inner conflict. And the inner conflict can only be resolved through creating even more confirmation bias for their argument, and they can't do that because they don't have an argument. So fallacious arguments are there all the time, and they just attempt to justify the lack of joined up thinking or knowledge. The emotional response soon depletes its victim, of course. This can carry on until death unless, of course, it's interrupted. Well, okay, so how is this interrupted? Well, only by information which proves that the belief system is to be questioned. And once this happens, then, of course, further inconsistencies show up, and eventually the inevitable happens and the system of control becomes clear. But 99% of people are nowhere near that simple analogy yet. And they've had quite a long time to catch up, to be fair. With the recent events, it seems that now most will never get to this stage, and that is what this new form of governance is all about. So this new form of global mafia Labour, this new system which is coming in Britain, which is accelerating everything, is really going to keep people in real arrested development. So if they get through one door, of course, then society and its peer pressures groups are waiting to bring them back into line. If they get further, there are methods of punishment waiting. Well, of course, what's needed is strategy. This is what we mentioned at the beginning. Playing the imposed system at its own game, of course, takes some knowledge, but not that much. We're living in a simplified system of memes. Most who break through the first barriers do not even have this knowledge, though. The knowledge only comes when the whole system becomes clear. Then revelation can take place. Well, in some, this creates an outpouring of information which alienates them from others, and they are then susceptible to be captured by the belief that there is no way out. There is no hope. This means that the system becomes impossible in their eyes to overthrow, as they are given rabbit holes on so many different subjects. If these subjects are not put into perspective, then they become overwhelming and confusing. They cause this cognitive dissonance and confusion that we see when we find these people have these strong opinions but no arguments to back them up. Their opinions have been given to them through memetic warfare, through memes. Well, that is the purpose of the manufacturing of media conspiracies, isn't it? They isolate one issue and remove it from the integrated system. So in other words, when you talk about the integrated system, that's a conspiracy theory. We're talking about this over here, and that's not part of what you're talking about. This means the newly aware individual is herded into one subject or a cause or some kind of reaction or protest group. And we've seen that, of course, with Just Stop Oil and the predecessor to that, Extinction Rebellion, which is a City of London state-backed project, which is just there to further the goals of sustainable development. And of course, community assemblies, the whole communitarian thing, that was like a political movement on its own in a cartoon style to get the middle classes to participate in their own dissolution. Of course, through distraction. So these groups are deliberately focused on one area and one area of distraction. The division is furthered by controlled group activities and, of course, unifying hate groups. They attack those who attack the divide and rule by ostracising them, using, of course, race, religion, identity politics, or other simplistic categories, which are actually not at all relevant to what is being talked about. Of course, the real and the stated goals, the cover story is always there to distract from what's going on underneath, so anything which does not help to put together the whole picture is a distraction. Hence, we have the immigrant crisis, the cost of living crisis, the climate crisis, the pandemic crisis. This is one driver. We're talking about one thing here. All those things are one. The only crisis is that the public cannot decode this. It is a crisis of the lack of integrated knowledge. There is only one global crisis, the crisis of lack of integrated and actionable knowledge. Terms used, of course, are national security, health security, global security. Security means restriction and strict control on all fronts through corporate partners, not even government. So, in effect, The use of the words crisis and emergency is for all individual drivers, and these are part, of course, an integrated overarching plan, which most people think is far too big for them to get their heads around. In fact, it's the opposite. It's so simplistic. It is much less distracting than party politics. So, if these are seen as individual problems, these individual crises, rather than part of an integrated plan, which of course interlinks global to local, there will of course be no progress. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing now. This is why we have single issues pushed all the time as they distract away from the overall plan. This is why there is no progress. There will, however, always be choice, as nothing can stop intelligence. And this is relating into what we've been talking about in the Perfected Mind Field shows. The unified field of intelligence and sentience. What is intelligence? Well, it's a field of awareness. It is expansive. The goal of education is to shut this down and put the overarching reality into smaller compartments with simple cover stories and timelines that a simple mind can remember and, of course, just repeat when necessary. It is used by those chosen as public purveyors of knowledge to distract from all opposing factors and basically to cement public opinion in the desired directions. In this way, so-called specialists and experts are created. They're created entirely for this purpose. They're not really specialists and they're certainly not experts. They take one driver of change and focus on it to the exclusion of all others. That is, all others of importance. Important subjects are protected by ring fencing. They cannot be talked about as they are protected, and anything outside the imposed narrative on the subject gets labelled as conspiracy theory or hate speak. So it is integrated thinking and problem solving which matters. That is why there are only problems presented, so the already decided outcomes can be imposed as the only possible solutions. Well, you limit the solutions and you control the outcome. A very good quote from the Rothschild banking family that I saw recently really was worth remembering. So one member of the Rothschild banking family, I'm not sure who it was actually, said, "I would rather be a Jew to the king than the king of the Jews." This governing concept is not thought about by the public as they do not think in terms of how governance actually works. So what this Rothschild was actually saying was how governance in reality works. To financially be in control of a monarchy or government means you are in effect the controller of that monarchy or government. The Bank of England lends to the government, not the other way round. It should be the government holding the financial power. This is common sense. These are basics. Public opinion is manufactured through corporate power, non-governmental organisations and a one-voice media which has different faces but one aim. Different moods, different sides, but all part of the same picture. Nothing outside it is allowed. Solutions, of course, are anathema. So in this period of time, the vocabulary of politics is simple but hides the real goals under the seemingly inclusive and innocuous statements, such as those we are hearing from the latest global mafia puppet, Keir Starmer. So, we've talked about technocracy. I'd like to take the conversation into a slightly different direction and talk about that now. The currency of technocracy and the new serf system is electricity, electrical currency. It is the most valuable commodity to the technocratic system. The technocratic system cannot work or function without electricity. Electricity is the lifeblood of this system. Without it, the system will not work. Think about that. Just think about that, because therein lies a clue to how you can become more self-realizing, self-sufficient, and I hate to say it, but empowered. I know that word has been absolutely denigrated. But let's take it back. Let's reclaim it, as they say. Money being printed and used only as an exchange for goods, of course, is worth nothing. And of course, when rampant inflation takes over, that becomes apparent. The control of commodities is all that the new rationing system is all about. The ownership of natural resources is the key to all power. There are no natural resources in Switzerland, but there is global power present there. The countries with the resources are victims of the plunder, legalised plunder. The current war in Ukraine can be seen in the bigger picture as a disagreement over its resources. The power structure put in place was merely for global looting. Russia needs to protect its citizens, of course, and also, most importantly, the war on its resources. This simple analogy explains the flaws in perception of governance, but more importantly, the flaws in public thinking about what governance actually is. Let's talk about simple solutions on an individual governing principle level. It is possible to live with very little. Once this is realised, many distractions disappear. People are programmed into protecting what they perceive as their property. Buildings which they cannot own and possessions which are mostly of no use. Now, we know that there is a war on physical property. And, of course, the right to own property should be inalienable. But we are now in a system where people will be coerced into giving up the property that they own, the money that they have created through their own labour. They're going to be coerced into giving it back to the global mafia in increasingly more imposing ways. The elite know they, in the bigger reality, own nothing, but they have use of everything they need. They use trusts and philanthropy as the front for all this. Usufruct is all we have and all we will ever have. This is a very important point because it goes into what property actually is. We have usufruct, which means an interest as a user of the property and the house that we may think we own. We have a usufructory interest in that property, nothing more. And it doesn't matter if you have a tenancy, a mortgage, or whether you own the property outright, as in freehold. There is no such thing as freehold in England. That's an interesting point. Same as in Wales. Scotland's slightly different. But, of course, Scotland has been conquered, along with Ireland, Wales, and now England. So, this idea of usufruct is being diminished into rationing and strict control of all action and all energetic principles. And these principles are things that we should not even have to even think about defending. The inalienable rights were God-given. The right to hold property is God-given. It is inalienable. So the new Labour globalists are godless. That is the point I'm trying to make here. So in their world, you have only rights that they allow you, all under strict rules, along with social responsibility, which in reality means you can't oppose their totalitarian new system, and you can't and are not allowed to question the obvious hypocrisy of these puppets. Global to local citizenry is actually what they are talking about. So, put yourself in a hypothetical situation. If you had to leave with only a few things you could carry, what then would you take? The need for objects of no purpose is very disabling. It creates inertia, indecision, and mental slavery. It is the cause of distraction and unnecessary worry. The only property you can say you own outright is your God-given mind and intelligence. That's the point I'm getting to here. Why then is this most important and only important possession that we actually own left unguarded? Why through consent is it willingly disturbed, willingly infiltrated through consent with all sorts of distraction, lies and utter nonsense? Why do people need psychologists, psychiatrists and even self-help gurus? I think there's more self-help gurus now than people who need help. So even the people who need help have become self-help gurus. Well, it's simply because, of course, the market forces of the system create both the problem and then give you the solution. It's only business and control, nothing personal whatsoever. And once this is known, then one can opt out of the market. And that is very important, because then there may be a revelation as to how things actually work. Now, there is this belief that when people lose everything, then they become desperate. So in other words, for them not to be allowed to become desperate or dangerous, they have to give things up willingly. And that's what this new system is, of course, all about. 20 years ago, people were saying, oh, the British will never give up their property. We're very, very close now. And the point about this is that people will be willing to give up their physical property because it is for the common good. They have been told it is for the good of all. And this is the new form of totalitarianism. It is all done through consent. There is no need for standing armies. There is no need for armies of Bolsheviks. There is no need for armies of revolutionaries, because the public are the revolution. So in this system, we cannot actually define where we are unless we know what it is all about. Cause and effect are most important. So what if self-help really came from the true self? The need for surface solutions, of course, and cover stories for all actions would then disappear. This would only be a problem, of course, for the Mafia system. It would definitely bring focus on the real and important over the illusory and trivial. We are being made to focus on the illusory and trivial to the detriment of our ownership of physical property, and more importantly, our real property, which is our intellect and our mind. So that, to me, is definitely worth pursuing. A rather philosophical end to this show, but I hope a useful one. I'm trying to come at this from different angles, but keep it simple. And do support the show if you can. info@windowsontheworld.net for anything you want to send in. And see you soon on Windows on the World. And do subscribe to us on Odyssey, Spreaker, or preferably Podbean. And I will be putting out more material over the next week. So, until then, and of course, every Sunday at 8 p.m. UK time, that's it from Windows on the World.